Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up with Jonathan Hickman's X-Men. Now, here's the thing. This is kind of funny. You guys recall when we were covering New Mutants, and we had that situation where the Starjammers had just kind of stolen this artifact, right? Like at the very beginning of the New Mutant story, the Starjammers stole this artifact and left the New Mutants behind in order to be captured. This is one of those things that Jonathan Hickman does, where he takes a small little thing and he ties it into a big thing later on down the line. Now, what's even more interesting is this will become even more important later on down the line, especially because we're probably going to end up having like some pretty massive or significant conflict or something like that. Keep in mind that it might take about 3 years for this whole thing to flesh out. That's about how long it took for his Avengers and New Avengers to conclude, right? A lot of people forget that. A lot of people think the whole thing was written in like a year. Doesn't really work that way. It took quite some time to reach the finish line when it came to that story. But what we're basically shown here is what's called the Brood. And there's the Brood race itself is kind of on the fringes of Shiar space, or at least one facet of it is. But essentially, these Brood have come to the realization that this artifact that was initially taken by the Starjammers and that's arrived with the New Mutants on Earth is basically a king egg. Now, what this means and why it matters will become important as we get through this story. And of course, we'll do a full-on explanation about the Brood, here in a little bit, because they really are the universe's most dangerous race, right? Like it's crazy how dangerous they are. But what we end up doing here is basically waking up with Vulcan. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that initially when Gabriel Summers first showed up, really seemed to first return during the events of Dawn of X, we didn't really know why he was here, right? We didn't even really know why he wasn't the same villain that he was, after the events of Deadly Genesis, right? If you guys recall the video that we did on X-Men Deadly Genesis, it basically detailed the return of Vulcan. Vulcan essentially being a villain of sorts, kind of hell-bent on a mission of revenge. And then ultimately, after learning the truth, he ended up traveling to the Shiar Empire, conquered it, and then went to war with the Inhumans and the Kree. And so because of that, he's a pretty significant threat. Like, he's an Omega level mutant, he's wildly powerful, but during the events of Dawn of X, he was suddenly there, right? He was presumed or basically seemed to have died, earlier in Marvel Comics, and then he was back and seemingly totally different with no real recollection of who he was. What we know now, by virtue of what Hickman's been showing us, is that he was resurrected, but he was resurrected without the memories of what he had done, presumably during the events of Rise and Fall, the Shiar Empire, and all that kind of stuff. It kind of sucks because that was some really cool storytelling when it came to Vulcan, but at the same time, it also kind of made sense, right? Because he was a character that Marvel just never really knew what to do with, right? So it kind of gives Hickman the ability to basically rework him and make him his own thing. The reason why I gave you that bit of an explanation is because what Vulcan's been doing is having dreams, right? Having dreams and nightmares, the same dream every single night. And it's always the same dream that he has, where basically he seems to like conquer the entirety of the Shiar Empire, and then basically the point where he dies, right? That kind of seems to be the same negative dream he has all the time. The issue with this is that before he can really detail things any further, suddenly the Brood are making their way to Earth. And that's when everybody begins to panic. That's when all hell begins to break loose, because the Brood are not one of these races where they just kind of show up and they say like, we are the Brood, we're here for a thing, and we demand that you give us that thing. And if you don't, then there's gonna be trouble. Boy, I promise you there's gonna be trouble. It doesn't really work that way, right? They just show up and they're like, give us your shit. Like, that's basically what they are. They just debo people is really all it is, right? And so as a result of that, the Brood showing up here, they just crash land on Earth. That's one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to hold off on this bit of an explanation, because the Brood are no joke, right? The Brood originally appeared in Marvel Comics back in Uncanny X-Men number 155, right? And right off the bat, they were just like, this race is savage, like in the most extreme degree. They were so savage, and things had gone south for the X-Men so bad that actually Xavier believed they had died, and that's why he formed the New Mutants team. The crazy thing here is that this is a race that literally just relies on overwhelming number. That's what they are. They're like the Xenomorphs from the Alien franchise, right? Just overwhelming number. And that's kind of what goes on here, is that the Brood are here looking for something, and you can't reason with them, you can't bargain with them. All you can do is just fight them off. And so the X-Men really kind of have to figure out why the Brood are here, and then, kind of nip that problem in the bud. And they don't really know, right? They don't really know why the Brood are here. All they really know is that the Brood are attacking. Now, the answer comes in the form of a younger member of the Brood called Broo, basically Brood without the D. Now, he was a character that originally appeared back in Astonishing X-Men Volume 3, issue number 40, who was basically a member of the Brood who was being grown in a lab that was ran by SWORD, the Sentient World Observation and Response Department, in order to understand understand the Brood physiology. Now, they also had a Brood Queen. When the Brood Queen was freed, she left Broo behind because unlike the normal members of the Brood drones, Broo felt like compassion and love and things like that. And so he was basically ostracized, kind of outed from the community and then sort of left behind. Now, eventually he was taken in by the X-Men and he had essentially been a member of the team ever since. He has intimate knowledge on like the Brood race and its form and its function and different things like that. And he's the one that basically tells the X-Men their Brood are here because of this king egg. And this is like, they will not stop. And he's right, like Broo is right. That's the important thing to understand. The X-Men may stop this wave of the Brood. The problem with that is the next wave will come. And then after that is the next wave. And then after that is the next wave. And and I mean, you got to remember, this is a race that spans in like countless numbers, the trillions, right? Spread all over the entirety of the universe, right? They're everywhere. Like they're all over the place. Just because you don't see them doesn't mean they're not there. They're like termites, right? Like they could be all over the place in your wall, but until you see one, you never know they're actually there, or unless your walls start falling apart, right? Like you go to tap part of your wall and the whole thing collapses. Well, then you know you got termites. But aside from something like that, this is a race that will constantly show up. It is a battle of attrition. They'll just wear the X-Men down until they get what they want, and then they will leave. And so Cyclops makes the smart move, and Cyclops is like, let's bail out of here, right? So he ends up grabbing Vulcan. He ends up grabbing basically everybody he can. He grabs Havoc. He's like, let's get out of here. And they end up bolting and basically, jumping through one of the gates, heading for Shiar space, right? One of the Krakoan gates. Again, we talked about how Cyclops made that request at the end of the last story that we did on New Mutants. This is the reason why those little tidbits matter, because it all kind of comes together when it comes to Hickman's storytelling. And so what you end up getting here is basically a member of the Accuser Corps. Now, why this Accuser Corps is here, the Accusers, of course, being agents of the Kree, why this Accuser is here will become important as time goes on. But this Accuser is basically trying to get information out of Robert DaCosta and out of Sam Guthrie in order to find out where this King Egg artifact is. Now, of course, this is, Robert DaCosta kind of goofing around and being a little silly and so on and so forth. But the fact that this is being done by DaCosta, or at least by this Accuser, does not go unnoticed by the Super Guardian. And so because of that, she basically ends up chiming into the Shiar Empire, specifically to the Magistrix, to the Gladiator's agent, and basically says, hey, look, there's an Accuser on the edge of Shiar space. We got to respond. That leads to the Shiar, Shiar getting involved, right? Because they don't take too kindly to a member of their, to a member of the Accuser Corps showing up on the doorstep of their empire, right? It's like not really your worst enemy, but certainly like a potential threat showing up on your doorstep and then just kind of, loitering around your property, right? Like, I mean, if you're like I am in Kentucky, we'll just get out and shoot you, right? I mean, that's just kind of how it is. That's how it is in Kentucky, right? You go loitering around the wrong property, they'll just come out and shoot you. Like it's kind of nuts. In the city of Lexington and in Louisville, they don't do that because you can't fire within the city limits. But nonetheless, at this point, we kind of end up jumping to the past. And this is where we sort of get this big explanation on everything that's going on here, right? Like everything with the King Egg and all that kind of stuff. This is why these things are so important, is because it's Hickman kind of changing a lot of things, right? What we're basically told here is that 8,000 years ago, the Kree ended up stumbling across the Brood. And how the Brood procreated was by literally infecting another biological being, right? And basically rematerializing them into the Brood. And so what they ended up learning is that, the Brood themselves consume not just the host, but all the host's knowledge, right? So in a lot of ways, you're like a biological version of the Borg from Star Trek, where the Borg basically assimilate you and all your knowledge gets, assimilated into the hive, into the Borg collective. And so they know everything you know. Hence the reason why the Borg were able to decimate the Federation during the Battle of Wolf 359, because they knew everything Picard knew. They knew how to circumvent the Federation's defense systems and all that kind of stuff. And so with that being the case, there's a kind of idea here that comes along where the Kree basically come up with this idea to weaponize the Brood. Now, this is an important thing to understand, is that you got into these various stories and different aspects of the Brood were kind of expanded on over the years, right? In the sense that you had basically what was called the Great Mother, which essentially the hierarchy followed, that you had an empress who was like the absolute divine ruler, the absolute ruler of all the Brood. And then while most Brood that existed within the universe existed by virtue of another biological being being turned into a Brood, the empress also had what were called her firstborn, right? Her actual biological children, like, giving birth to actual Brood. After the empress, you had the firstborn, and then you had the queens, then you had like smaller versions of queens, and then you had drones, right? So, but the issue here is that at the time, we never really knew what the origin of the Brood was. We just knew that they were there in Marvel Comics. We just knew that they kind of existed. There was no real explanation in terms of where they came from or anything like that. What Jonathan Hickman basically changed up here is he introduced the idea of there basically being a kind of rift in space where the Brood are not native to the main Marvel universe, right? They're not from here. Instead, they're from a collapsed universe, like a collapsing universe that basically fell apart and ended up coming here. And so essentially they're not from this universe, they're from a different universe, but now they inhabit inside this universe, right? And so that's where things get a little murky. That's where things get a little chaotic, is because they're not really from here. But the Kree look at them nonetheless and say, okay, so the entire form and function of this brood race is they essentially follow a hive mentality, that you have a singular leader under, that controls the entire hive. And then within that hive, you have various, queens, and, each one of the queens leads a faction, different things like that. You have all these little situations set up, but what we can do is we can weaponize all of this. We can basically create a singular being that can dominate the entirety of the brood hive, and then basically either seed or sow disarray, or we can use it to our own ends. Whatever the case is, we can weaponize this whole thing. And that was the basis behind the creation of the king egg, specifically because of the fact that the Supreme Intelligence had looked into the future, at least used mathematical probability to determine which of the existing races across the cosmos in Marvel Comics would be the most viable threat to the Kree later on down the line, and determined that it would be the Shiar. And that's true, right? The Shiar are technically the most advanced race in Marvel Comics. They're composed of a bunch of different races, all of which have sworn fealty to the Shiar Empire, or maybe they were just straight up conquered. But whatever the case is, like, they're composed of a bunch of different races that all have their benefits and drawbacks, right? Strontians and different things like that, who are all essentially analogs for Superman. And so as a result of this, it's one of these things where like all hell can pop off here, all hell can break loose. And so kind of jumping to Gladiator and the Accuser, this guy's dealt with pretty readily, right? This one, kind of jumping back to the present day, Gladiator going after this guy deals with this Accuser pretty quickly, right? Ends up knocking him out of the ship. The Accuser dies in space, and then he's eaten by one of the giant, space whales, basically, that the Brood are controlling to travel from one location to the next. What the Brood do, they basically, kill these things and then hijack the nervous system and then take it over, right? And then just kind of pilot it. It's like controlling a human as a puppet is more or less what this is equivalent to. The issue is that where the initial expectation of the Starjammers and, the Shiar Imperial Guard and like the X-Men and all these groups here is like, okay, let's go ahead and like land on this space station and then, leave, send the brood egg to the surface, and then, or I guess the king egg to the surface, and call it a day. The station's destroyed as well, leaving them no real option except to, basically crash land on this sentient world. And that's where things kind of pop off, is because over the years, what Hickman really hits at here is across the universe, what you have is like all these varying factions of the brood, right? You have like a faction here, and you have a faction there, and you have a faction back there, and you got a faction over there, and they're all led by individual queens, right? Each one of the queens leads those factions. There's no indication here that there is currently an empress in existence. And so what this means is that all the brood individual factions are self-governing. There's no one controlling all of them. So factions will go to war with other factions over territory or resources or whatever the case happens to be. And so as a result of that, because of this king egg, what this is doing is basically, it's like the dinner bell, right? It's bringing in all these brood from all across the cosmos, right? Because brood can smell this king egg from galaxies away, right? So like 3 or 4 galaxies away. And if one of those galaxies, there's a billion brood, then guess what? That billion brood is heading to this planet. That's exactly what's happening here. And so with that going down, like brood are constantly arriving on this world. And while you do have some exceedingly powerful characters here, you've got Vulcan, you've got Cyclops, you've got, you've got Gladiator, you got all these guys. While you have some exceedingly powerful characters here, the reality is no matter how powerful they are, they will start to fall. One by one, they will start to fall and they will start to die. And they'll lose against the power of the brood. That's just the way it is. These just overwhelming numbers. As powerful as these guys are, they cannot continually fight against billions of drones for any real continued amount of time. And so all it's going to take is for one of them to be infected. But then suddenly it all stops. In the middle of nowhere, all the broods stop moving. Just like that. Like they stop moving, they stop attacking, they all just back off and they all just stop. And so what you end up having, of course, are like these massive, brood that are sort of standing around there. And then you've got Broo himself, who basically ate the egg, right? Like he consumed the egg. And that's really the way this king egg works. It doesn't really give birth to a brood king. Instead, it contains a kind of substance inside of it, a kind of serum. And the individual that consumes it will kind of become the new brood king, more or less. Now, presumably, because of the fact that the brood basically exists in terms of their control over, the queens control the drones, and the queens in turn are controlled using a combination of like pheromones and telepathy, what this seems to do is basically amplify the abilities of an existing brood, right? So, take that brood and then give them like a super high level of telepathy and then like a super advanced version of the pheromones, so they can essentially force the other members of the brood or convince the other members of the brood to do their bidding. But that's basically what this is. Right now, you've got a brood king, which means the entirety of the brood race, the most dangerous race in all of existence, is currently under the control of a singular being. And that's cool, right? That's a super cool idea. But the brood are super awesome, guys. I'm really excited to see what Jonathan Hickman ends up doing with this. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.